Welcome back, Sebastian here. So today I'm going to be doing my power rankings for the Dutch Grand Prix yesterday. So really exciting race, a really chaotic race as well, with the dry, then wet, and wet, then dry, then wet to finish. And also a lot of variability with the strategy. So I found that thinking about doing these power rankings, I found that the strategy definitely played a bigger element in how people's races went than it usually does. So it's something that's kind of a caveat overall with these power rankings. Of course, these aren't just for the Dutch Grand Prix, they're for the last month and a half, 2 months or so. So number 20, staying in the same position, unfortunately for him, is Logan Sargent. So big crash in qualifying, that would have cost quite a bit for the budget cap, and then another crash in the race. The crash is come out after the fact that the crash in the race was not his fault. It was some kind of hydraulic failure with the steering column. So that being said, even if you kind of eliminate blame from the second crash, I still don't think it was a great weekend. The crash in qualifying, and even though he did make it into Q3, the reality is the Williams, for whatever reason, was very, very good this weekend. Albon qualified 4th. So still very, very far off his teammate. So that being said, not a great weekend overall, so he stays in 20th. Number 19, staying in the same position, is Zhou Guangyu. So for Zhou, a tricky weekend. Out-qualified his teammate Bottas, which is definitely good. That being said, in the race, his team really capitalized on the strategy, and he was up in the podium places at one point on the intermediate tires. But that being said, didn't really have the pace to stay there, and I think when they switched back to the dry tires, he fell down the order quite a bit. Then had that big heavy crash at the end of the race to bring out the red flag. So overall not a fantastic race. Number 18, dropping one position, is Lance Stroll. So for Lance Stroll, another weekend with no points, and his teammate Alonso is on the podium, bagging another 18 points. So for Stroll, couldn't get into Q3, so that was definitely a big miss there. The race, he was hindered by strategy, but that being said, other cars that are relatively the same pace as them, the McLarens, the Mercedes, also had some pretty bad strategies early on in the race, and they were able to make their way up through the field to those points-paying positions eventually, such as Hamilton and Norris. So for Stroll, he was really just kind of stuck in the back and wasn't really able to make a move. So I've dropped him down one position. So fret not, Daniel Ricciardo fans. I've not eliminated your driver from my power rankings, but that being said, I've decided to stick it to the 20 drivers who raced in the last race. So whenever Ricciardo comes back, he'll be back on the power rankings. But for now, we have our debutant, a driver who came in to his first ever Grand Prix weekend, and what a Grand Prix he came in for. So Liam Lawson, number 17. Qualifying was a struggle. I think it was kind of expected. The first part of qualifying, I was watching the times between him and Tsunoda, and he was honestly able to stay within, a second of Tsunoda, roughly, sometimes even half a second. But that final run in Q1 wasn't able to get the lap down, which is why the gap ended up being so big with the track evolution. The race was all right. He, of course, had to serve that penalty. That being said, kept it clean, kept on track, and really going into this weekend, not even considering all the weather, that would have been the goal for the weekend. Finished ahead of his teammate. Of course, I think his teammate had a very good weekend. He was very unfortunate to get that penalty. But for Lawson, 17th on my power rankings. Number 16, moving up 2 positions, is Kevin Magnussen. So for Magnussen, not a fantastic weekend. Had that crash in free practice. Qualifying was a bit of a struggle, as it's been recently. The race, I thought, was honestly pretty good. Made use of a very good strategy, switching from the intermediate to the dry tires, I believe. And he was up in a very good points position. Unfortunately, the Haas does not have the race pace, doesn't have the tire life to be able to stay in those positions, and he gradually fell down the order. Finished ahead of his teammate Hulkenberg though, and overall I think really the best he could have hoped for Magnussen in the race. Number 15, dropping 2 positions, is Valtteri Bottas. So for Bottas, out-qualified by his teammate Joe, not a great qualifying. Sunday was pretty anonymous, which makes sense given how much chaos and how much action there was throughout the field. Didn't really have I don't think he ever had a particularly good strategy because unlike Zhou or Magnussen, he never had a moment where he was suddenly up in the points paying positions and was just kind of doing his thing the whole race. Number one, moving up one position, which I know seems strange, is Nico Hülkenberg. Qualifying was pretty good, qualified in Q2. Race was pretty anonymous, pretty quiet, and that being said, I don't really hold that too much against him. But I just felt that, I felt he had a better weekend overall than Bottas did. Number 13, moving up one position, is Yuki Tsunoda. So for Tsunoda, qualifying we can't really say much because of course his teammate Lawson's first ever qualifying only had Saturday morning practice. So qualifying, that being said, still got himself into Q2, pretty good job for him. The race looked like he might have been on for a point or two at some points in the race, but I think a really, really terrible strategy by AlphaTauri, leaving him out on the soft tires for, 40 laps or so. Really cost him in the end, and didn't really give him any chance of getting points. The penalty as well I thought was very, very harsh. Just looked like it was a racing incident, so a bit of an unfortunate penalty for Tsunoda, and as it was right after a red flag, that 5 seconds dropped him much farther than it would have if we had never had that red flag. Number 12, moving down one position, is Sergio Perez. So for Sergio Perez, really tricky weekend in race overall. Qualifying, qualified P7, about 1.3 seconds off his teammate. Definitely not a great result in qualifying. Saturday benefited massively from the strategy at the start, going on the intermediate tires. Had basically a 13-14 second lead over his teammate, and there were points where I'm like, oh, that's a pretty big gap. And Verstappen basically turned that gap into nothing almost instantly, and probably some of the craziest laps I've ever seen him do. But for Perez, that will definitely be disappointing, the fact that he was basically eaten alive by his teammates during that intermediate stint. Came back on the hard tires, on the dry tires, during the middle phase of the race, and was looking basically to be in third place the whole time, basically lost his spot to Alonso during the pit stops. And then as well, when it got wet, he went and had his moment at turn 1. Actually, no, I think I got the order wrong. He was P2, yes, Perez was P2 for most of the race, and then lost that position spitting at turn 1 when it got wet. So small mistake there, and then of course he made the other mistake where he basically hit the wall and going into the pit entry and got himself a 5-second penalty. So a bit of a rough weekend as a whole, which of course then dropped into 4th. This is probably, one of his worst tracks in F1. The fact that the gap between himself and Verstappen is consistently this big at this track, and he'll definitely be looking forward to some of the tracks we have coming up, Monza, Singapore, some of the tracks he's a little bit better at. Number 11, dropping 2 positions, and this one I think was a bit harsh because he was driving pretty well, I thought, and that is Esteban Ocon. Really rough qualifying, knocked down Q1. The race, he always looked to be a little bit behind his teammate Gasly's pace. And I know he was pretty frustrated with how things ended at the end. Basically, instead of going on the intermediate tire, the team opted for the full wet tire, and he was livid about that, absolutely livid on the radio about those wet tires. So that ultimately really sunk his race, but he always looked to be a little bit behind his teammate Gasly. Number 10, also dropping down 2 positions, but I think this is quite harsh. But that being said, I do feel like there were 2 drivers I had to move ahead of George Russell. So Russell, really good performance on Saturday. Would have been expecting a podium finish of some kind coming into the weekend, coming into the race, given that they thought they had pretty good race pace. Of course, Mercedes really dropped the ball with the strategy going onto the intermediate tires. And from there, both him and his teammate were basically having to fight through the field when we eventually got back onto the dry tires. I think he was really unfortunate to get that puncture at the end after the contact with Norris, which dropped him to the back. But that being said, pretty much a pretty tricky race for him. And I did think the other reason I dropped him down was I did feel like Hamilton did have a better race overall than him. Number 9, pretty good weekend for this driver, and that is Carlos Sainz. So out-qualified Leclerc. Of course, that was not super hard after Leclerc basically crashed himself out of qualifying. But honestly, I was pretty impressed with his race. Kept it clean, kept it on the road, and I think was fighting with cars that didn't really have much business fighting. Of course, he'll probably be disappointed to lose out on a potential podium. I think a podium could have been in the cards, but that being said, had some nice battles with Gasly, had some nice battles with Alonso as well. And I think did a really good job and maximized his points tally today. Number 8, dropping 4 positions. Oh, Charles. So, Charles Leclerc dropping down 4 positions to 8th. Of course, had that big crash in qualifying. Without that, could have qualified top 4, top 5 maybe. And in the race, he of course had that minor contact with Norris, I believe, or was it Piastri? It was with McLaren. And then the damage from that contact went in under his floor. And very similar to Verstappen last year at Silverstone, the car was basically undrivable after that. So for that mistake the contact looked like a small mistake from him. But that being said, after that, it's not really his fault that the car is basically undrivable with these ground effect cars when they get damage. Number 7, moving down 1 position. A bit of a disappointing race for this driver, but I did think they showed a lot of fight, and that is Oscar Piastri. So for Piastri, a bit of a disappointing qualifying, couldn't get the lap together at the end of qualifying. The race was pretty good though. But very similar to Russell, he was basically forced to fight back through the field after the kind of pretty awful strategy that they went on, staying on the soft tires throughout the entire rain period. Really dropped him down the order. That means that similar to the 2 Mercedes and his teammate Norris, I thought he did a pretty decent job at fighting his way through the field, and definitely one of the trickiest races that he's been in. Number 6, the biggest mover up this weekend is Pierre Gasly. So for Gasly, absolutely fantastic podium, first podium with Alpine, and I believe his first podium since, when would have been last, I guess, Azerbaijan 2021, I believe, is the last podium. So excellent result for Gasly. He'll be very, very happy with that. He looked very good all weekend, of course. Qualifying was a bit of a struggle with the Alpines, but the race, he always seemed to be in the right place at the right time, always be on the right strategy. And he also made some very, very good moves as well, and had a very solid race pace throughout the race. So he'll be extremely happy with that result. Number 5, one of the stars of the weekend, moving up 2 positions, is Alex Albon. So for Albon, really, really good result. I think qualifying really exceeded both his expectations and the team's expectations. Qualifying 4th. The race, I don't think they knew that they weren't going to have the race pace that they had in qualifying, and I kind of knew that as well. I didn't really expect a top 4 or top 5. I thought maybe they could get bottom end of the points, and that's kind of exactly what ended up happening despite all of the chaos from the race. P8 finish for Albon moves his total up to 15 and builds a nice small cushion over for Williams over Haas in the Constructors' Championship. So overall, really, really solid race by Albon. Number 4, moving down 1 position, and it's not because I thought this driver had a bad weekend. It's just I had another driver that I wanted to move up ahead, and that is Lewis Hamilton. A bit of a tricky Saturday, started very far down. Of course, that all of the starting positions from qualifying were basically kind of thrown out the window after the switch to the intermediate tires. So for Hamilton, I thought he had a really good race though, really excellent race, fought his way through the field. But I thought that there was a driver behind him who is a little bit better this past weekend, which is why I moved him ahead, and that is Fernando Alonso. So coming in this weekend, Aston Martin have been on a run of pretty mediocre results. Alonso hasn't gotten a podium since Canada, and coming into this weekend, Alonso came 5th in qualifying. Pretty good result, I thought, given the struggles in qualifying recently. And in the race, comes home 2nd place, really good result. Was putting pressure on Perez in the dry at various points, and kept it clean, no mistakes. So amazing result for Alonso and for Aston Martin. So that leaves our 2 drivers. Number 2 with a pretty good result. And I think after a string of excellent results before the summer break, I think today was a little bit more meh. And it did kind of move him a little bit closer to this group of Alonso and Hamilton. So I think these 3 drivers right now are very, very, very close. but I've kept Norris in the same position. Qualified front row, so excellent qualifying. The race, McLaren's strategy was not great, but unlike Hamilton, like Russell and Piastri, had to fight his way through the field and did a really good job doing that. Almost got Hamilton on the line for 6th place, but wasn't to be 7th place in the end, but still a really good result for him. And that leaves one driver left, and that is, of course, our one Mr. Max Verstappen, who has now tied the all-time record for consecutive wins, 9 straight wins, tying Sebastian Vettel and unofficially Alberto Ascari as well, if you discount the Indy 500s from the 1950s. So overall, really good race for him, for Verstappen. Pole position, took dutifully, took pole position. Kind of lost out with that initial phase of the race with the intermediates, but had some of the absolute best laps I've ever seen a driver have during those intermediate phase. Basically where he was catching Perez at like 4 seconds a lap on the same tire. Absolutely crazy. In the dry, managed to kept it under control and didn't make a single mistake when things got wet at the end. So overall, exceptional race for Verstappen, and of course a 3rd straight win at his home Grand Prix. So that is all for my power rankings for after the Dutch Grand Prix. Of course, I'll be back again next weekend with the Italian Grand Prix. So please leave your thoughts in the comment section below. Who was your driver of the weekend? Who do you think improved the most or impressed you the most compared to previous races? Thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.